Good morning, everybody. Uneducated economist here. So, there is a ton of news out there. I'm going to leave a bunch of links down in the description for you guys. First thing I'd like to talk about is these Russian bonds. Now, it looks like they're going to go ahead and get the coupon payment made, so that if you are a holder of these Russian bonds, you will get your coupon payment, your interest payment on that bond. But leading up to this day, up to this point, it was very questionable on whether or not that coupon was going to get paid and if those bonds were going to default. And now, I had done a few videos talking about this scenario, and what I found interesting is that the credit default swaps that were issued to cover these things, the issuers of those credit default swaps said that they may not cover these things because this particular type of default would be out of their scope of obligations. And so, like, if you were a holder of these bonds, you're like, wait a minute, Russia may not pay the coupon on it, and then the insurance policy that I bought to cover this particular investment is also saying that you won't cover it, so I am really screwed out of this investment. What does the value of that particular asset become? It becomes pretty much worthless, right? I mean, it's in threat of default, and then the insurance companies, basically the insurance, is saying that no, we're not going to cover that either. So the value of this thing, what you could sell it for, probably plummets pretty good. We did a video on that, talking about there being blood in the streets and how some of these big banks are coming in and mopping it up, right? Well, here it is today, and whether or not the default was actually going to take place, Russia says, hey, you know what? You froze our assets, unfreeze the assets and make the payments, right? We're telling you, go ahead and do it. We have the money. So now it put it up into America's court, right? That's what ultimately they were saying. It was just like, you froze our assets, unfreeze them and make the payment. So it's on you now. They had to do it. I know there was no other choice but to go ahead and unfreeze the assets or whatever it is that they had to do in order to get the payments to go through. Because this was going to cause a contagion experience. I mean, a contagion effect anyway. Very much like what took place with Evergrande. And when Evergrande started to go down, when they were not able to roll their debts over into new debts, and they started defaulting on their payments, or at least not being able to make the coupon payments on their debts, not being able to pay their contractors, stuff like that, this started having an effect on the rest of the operations and contractors that were affiliated with Evergrande, because ultimately when Evergrande would pay a lot of these people, they would pay them in something called commercial paper, and it's very much like a bond. It's just instead of like having a coupon payment to it, usually it sells at a discount to the face value, so that when it matures, that you get a little bit more than what you paid for it. So for example, if it has a face value of $100, you might receive it at 97, and then in a year when it matures, you get the interest, you get the face value of it, and you gain that little bit of interest by holding on to it for a year. At any given time, you can generally sell it in between for somewhere in between those two, whatever the value might be. Whoever, is willing to hold on to it for maturity and take that risk and gain that little bit of interest off of it. So what ends up happening is that if you have been paid in this commercial paper from like a corporation like this, then you're sitting on assets and liabilities, that being one of your assets. If all of a sudden it's not paying and it's not worth what it says it is, that asset begins to fall. Now your liabilities are more than your assets, your credit rating begins to fall, and now you're in the same position as Evergrande is, and you can't roll your old debts over into new debts, and you can't make your payments, and everything else starts going. And it starts leading over into the contractors and other corporations that you're working with. Same thing. So it just starts bleeding from one into the other. So same thing could happen with the Russian debt. I'm not saying that this was definitely going to happen, but it's the type of thing that could happen. And this is where, like, if you are an entity who held Russian debt, who held these Russian bonds, and all of a sudden they're going to go into default, and your assets and liabilities all of a sudden get, you have more liabilities than your assets, and now you're having trouble with your credit ratings and rolling your old debts into new debts, and the same thing begins to happen. So it was almost as if they didn't have any other choice. Like, if the credit default swaps weren't going to pay to make the investors whole again, then, and the things actually did default, it could start dragging down the rest of the sovereign debts around the world, or anybody else who held on to Russian debt, it would start dragging them down as well. Now, from what I understand, a lot of this Russian debt was actually held within the Russian borders, so to speak, like within the confines of the government and the corporations that are within that sovereign nation. I couldn't tell you how much foreign holdings of it and who held it, but to see that the payment did go through leads me to believe that they were probably worried of something of such nature kind of happening. I know that it's a very precarious situation, the sovereign debt and corporate debt market, in that at any given time that a meltdown of this could very much take place, very similar to what took place during the housing market. So keeping an eye on the bond market is where all eyes should be. I mean, it's going to start in a sovereign debt or corporate debt or something. It's going to be a sovereign debt crisis, corporate debt crisis, something of that nature that's really going to change the way things are done. And you can already see it taking place, and that's where the other articles begin to start to come in here, because right now, like, sanctions on Russia has Russia in a very like tight spot, but they are pumping out more oil than they ever have, and that's something that I found interesting. I'm going to leave a link down in the description for you guys. And you got nations like China and India who are willing to do business. And now you got to think, these are the two biggest nations in the entire world, right? Like, I mean, as far as population goes. So when it comes to people and consumption, I don't think that Russia is too worried if they can get these two particular entities on board, you know, these two nations. So I found that to be pretty interesting, as far as like the idea that that you put sanctions on these on like Russia's exports, and you start pressuring other nations to do the same. Well, here you're going to find other nations who will be like, why are we self-sanctioning? Like, why aren't we just doing business with Russia? They have all this oil they've pumped. They're probably selling it for cheap because they don't have anybody else they're doing business with. And the United States are kind of being jerks with this whole, like, you know, you can only do business if we say so kind of thing. So much for freedom and liberty. You know, if that's the kind of like attitude that a foreign nation might take, it would be like, why are we, you know, what's up, Russians? Let's do business. I mean, that's like kind of how it would go. Like, you know, why would you spend more when you don't have to, especially if you're not that great of friends? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, these are all, like I said, these are some of the links that I'm going to leave down there for you guys. And then also there's like another interesting article, like one of them that we had talked about, and I wish I had seen this article ahead of time before I had done the video, because really it goes very much in line with what I was saying about like all these sanctions and everything else that is going on out there that is causing like other nations and other like corporations to question whether or not they should be doing business inside of the dollar. What else is there for an alternative? And that's really what it comes down to, is that there is no other alternative to the dollar. Nothing that even comes remotely close to it. And probably the number one issue with having the world reserve currency is Triffin's dilemma. And that is, how do you export enough money into the global currency or into the global supply? How do you do that and still be like a manufacturing nation? Because ultimately there is no way to supply the world with dollars unless you plan on buying all the stuff. That is the best way to supply the world with enough currency to do business, is by buying their stuff. And that's why we ended up being the greatest debtor nation and consuming nation in the world, is because when you issue out as many bonds as we do, like the United States goes into debt as much as it is, that those bonds are ultimately used as world currency. Like if you are going to do a transaction in dollars, a lot of times you are going to end up doing it in US treasuries, because when at least you're holding US treasuries, you gain a little bit of interest off of it. They're almost as good as dollars. So you have to have a bond market that's big enough, you have to be willing to go in debt enough, and then you also have to be able to consume enough of the world's stuff in order to supply them with the dollars that they need in order to do the world business that they do. I mean, at least this is the way I see it. And when it comes to like getting out of the dollar, there's nothing else there. But now we got like digital currencies, and we got the central bank digital currencies, and we got gold, but then again, it's bulky, it's hard, it's protected. You got to protect it, you got to transfer it. There's ways of doing like digital transferring of gold. Like you could go through a third party warehouse, so to speak, that would store your gold, and then you could do digital transferring of gold and take possession of it if you needed to. There's that kind of concept, but then you're relying on a third party again. And how do you trust that third party without falling back into the fiat currency game? You simply just can't do it. So, what else did I want to bring up on this? There's probably a bunch of stuff to talk about, but anyway, that's probably long enough. Uneducated economist. You guys let me know.